Why are stories so powerful to us? They help us connect with each other. If you are with a group of people that you know well, you will almost immediately lapse into telling stories, catching up with each other. And if you are with a group of people that you don't know well, but longer than small chit-chat will suffice, you will soon end up telling stories about your kids, about your grandkids, about what's going on in the world, about programs you've seen recently, all kinds of things. And stories are the way that we connect with each other. They're the way that we share ourselves. Stories are also the way we communicate what we deeply believe. There is a story that I don't know if it's historically accurate, but I still believe that it's true, that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was, apart from the Bible, the best-selling book of the entire 19th century. And Uncle Tom's Story told a story about a slave family and the horrors of slavery, and it is credited with moving the northern states to being willing to enter into a war. That it was so graphic, it was so lively, it was so true, even though it was fictional, that it created imagination that this horror of slavery had to end. And the story goes that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he greeted her by saying, "So this is the little lady," she was not 5 foot tall, "this is the little lady who wrote that big book that started this whole war." Stories persuade us, move us in ways that mere facts never can. Stories give us hope in a way that facts can't. When my kids were maybe 8 and 10 years old, my parents were visiting from Pennsylvania. And I remember two stories, or I remember a story that my dad told them. He had grown up in Pennsylvania on the Susquehanna River. And he told a story about when he was 10 years old, and there was a flood of the Susquehanna. It was called the Flood of the Century. And although they lived blocks from the river, they had to be rescued out of the second story of their home. And my dad was telling my kids, who were the age that he was when the story was taking place, about waiting at the window of his parents' bedroom and seeing two boats coming down the street, which was now a river. The first was a canoe, and then the second was a huge rowboat. And in the canoe, a guy was paddling and kind of looking, scanning around. And when he saw my dad and his parents, my dad was an only child, he called back over his shoulder to the rowboat, "Two big ones, one little one. Two big ones, one little one." And then kept going down. And then the rowboat came over and rescued them out of their house and going on. And I remember just in that moment thinking about how connected they were through the telling of that story, that my children had a chance to imagine their grandfather not as someone who was about 80 years old at the time, but rather someone who had lived a life like they had and gone through that. And then about a month later, so this is summer in Minnesota, we were all down in our basement because there was a tornado warning. And we had one little utility room there were no windows, and that's where we'd go when there were tornado warnings, but we left the TV on in the nearby room, and it was kind of narrating the progress of the tornadoes through. And we're kind of down there waiting, and one of the kids says, "Hey, Dad, tell us a story about Grandpa and the flood." And what I realized was that story meant more than simply a connection to their grandpa. It meant a sense of hope. That you can come through hard things, that sometimes life is scary and it will be okay. And so what was way more powerful in that moment was to tell that story again rather than saying, "Well, you know, kids, tornadoes rarely hit metro areas because of the concentration of heat." which all is true, by the way. It was very unlikely our house was going to be taken up by a tornado. But what mattered, what made the difference in that moment was a story. And that's what we do when we tell stories. And finally, stories, they move us to action. When you hear a powerful story, you respond. And that's what you can see in this congregation time after time when we hear about flooding in Texas or fires in California or Afghan refugees coming over and being resettled. It's fine to share statistics, but when you hear a story about how that affects people, you want to do something. And at the end of the day, in all of these ways, stories tell us the truth. They tell us the truth in a way that facts never can. And so when I think about that saying by Muriel Rukeyser, the universe is made up of stories, not atoms, I think that's what she means, that stories are the common currency with which we share our lives with each other.